Unit 2, Recording 4. Story A. This story is called The Telltale Heart, and it's a short story written by the American writer Edgar Allan Poe in the 1840s, so a long time ago, but it's quite a famous story in American literature, and there have been a couple of films based on it too. It's a very short, quite simple story in a way, and it's told in the first person. The narrator starts by claiming that he is not in the slightest bit insane, even though he has murdered someone, which of course is instantly disturbing, so right from the beginning you have a strong sense of unease. The narrator tells us that he has murdered an old man, not because he hated him or because he wanted his money, but because he couldn't bear the old man's evil blue eye. You never really find out what his relationship is with the old man, but you get the impression that he lives with him, maybe as a servant or something like that. Again, he insists that he is not insane, and as evidence of that, he describes the calm, cold-blooded way in which he planned the murder. He describes how every day, for 7 days, he put his head round the old man's bedroom door during the night and stood with a covered lantern, and then shone a thin beam of light into the man's eye at midnight. However, every night the man's eye is closed, so he leaves the man unharmed, holding an unlit lantern in silence while the old man is sleeping. Then, on the 8th night, the old man hears him as he enters the room and wakes up, terrified. For a whole hour, the narrator, the murderer, stands in the darkness in the old man's bedroom in silence, not moving a muscle. And even though there isn't a single sound, you know that the old man knows that someone is there and that he has a strong sense of foreboding. And the tension builds up and builds up. The narrator can hear the old man's heart beating louder and faster, and at that point he finally shines the light into the man's eye, which this time is wide open. The old man screams because he knows his life is about to end, and at this point the narrator moves quickly and murders him, smothers him presumably. It's a bit ambiguous in the story. And all the time, the narrator is reassuring the reader that he is completely sane, and as proof, he describes how cleverly he hid the body, how he lifted up the floorboards and hid the body under there, then nailed them back down and cleared away all the mess. But anyway, someone has heard the old man's scream, because the police come round to interview the narrator, and he takes them into the room where the old man died, and they sit in chairs just above where the body is hidden, and the police interview him. But he tells them that the old man has gone away to stay in the country for a while, and according to him, the narrator, he is so calm and pleasant that the policemen don't suspect him at all. Except that, as the conversation goes on, the narrator starts to hear a sound, and the sound gets louder and louder, and he is convinced that it is the sound of the old man's heart beating, coming up from beneath the floorboards, and it's getting more and more deafening, and he can't understand why the policeman can't hear it too. Anyway, I won't give away the ending, but it's a very, very chilling story. Not one that you would want to read when you are alone late at night. Story B.
One of my favourite stories is Les Miserables. I've seen the film and the musical several times, and I'm always in floods of tears by the end because it's so tragic and so moving. It's based on the book by the French writer Victor Hugo, which I must admit I haven't actually read because it's extremely long. Anyway, it's set in France at the beginning of the 19th century, and it concerns the situation of the poor, and particularly the way the criminal justice system treats them. It's a very long story, with several subplots which are too complicated to go into, but the main thread of the plot concerns an ex-convict called Valjean, and the story opens as he is released from prison after serving 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread. In prison, he has been mistreated by a law enforcement officer called Javert, who appears and reappears throughout the story, pursuing him wherever he goes. Valjean is taken in by a kindly local bishop, and despite the fact that Valjean steals from him, the bishop treats him with trust, gives him some silver, and makes him promise to reform. Thanks to this kindness, Valjean rises to become a factory owner and the mayor of a local town. However, he changes his identity in order to hide his criminal past. Meanwhile, a fallen woman called Fantine comes to work at Valjean's factory. She has an illegitimate daughter called Cosette, who she can't afford to look after and has to send away to live with a family who treat the little girl like a slave. To make matters worse, Fantine loses her job at the factory, and when she defends herself against a man who attacks her, she is arrested by the law enforcement officer Javert. Eventually, she dies heartbroken. Javert also recognizes Valjean, who he wants to arrest for assuming a false identity, but Valjean escapes and goes off to rescue Fantine's daughter, Cosette. So, Valjean adopts Cosette as his daughter and they move to Paris. There, the now grown-up Cosette falls in love with a wealthy law student called Marius, who is part of a radical group campaigning for democracy and justice for the poor. There are many more complicated subplots, and Javert continues to pursue Valjean, but anyway, the story culminates in an uprising against the government, which ends in failure and in the death of many brave young men who have been fighting for justice. In the course of all this, Valjean saves Javert's life. However, Javert, in turmoil over his failure to capture Valjean and Valjean's compassion towards him, commits suicide. During the uprising, Valjean also saves Marius, who, once recovered, marries Cosette. However, all is not well, as Valjean, after admitting his criminal past to Marius, goes into hiding from the law, leaving Cosette in distress. Eventually, Marius realizes that Valjean saved his life, so he takes Cosette to see the dying Valjean, and they are finally reunited on his deathbed, where the story ends. The whole story just fills you with this huge sense of injustice and despair at the way poor people just cannot escape their past or fight the system, which is completely against them. Certain moments in the story, like Fantine's death, are just heartbreaking. But at the same time, certain parts of it are very uplifting, like when the bishop helps Valjean at the beginning, or the idealism of the students in the uprising. The songs in the musical and film are also amazing, and the story never fails to move me.